Hello everyone. Please tell me, which city are you listening from? What time is it there? The rain had been falling steadily for hours, a soft patter against the window, almost rhythmic, as if it had been pouring non-stop for days. I was driving through the countryside, on my way to a small town that I'd been told had an old church that might interest me. It wasn't part of any tourist guide, nor was it some kind of hidden gem. It was just a church, one that had been abandoned for years. But something about it intrigued me. I wasn't religious, not in any conventional sense, but there was a haunting mystery to the place that I couldn't shake. When I finally arrived, the storm outside had thickened. The clouds hung heavy in the sky, and the wind picked up, rustling the trees that lined the road. The church was tucked away on the outskirts of town, away from the main roads and the houses. The air felt colder here, the kind of chill that nips at the skin, sinking deep into your bones. The building was old, its stone walls worn by time, with ivy creeping up the sides, enveloping it like nature was trying to reclaim it. The steeple rose high above, its pointed roof jagged against the gray sky, and there was something about the church that made me hesitate for a moment before stepping out of the car. The heavy wooden door to the church creaked as I pushed it open. The inside was dark, save for a faint light coming from the far end of the room. My eyes were slow to adjust, the low light making it hard to see much at first. As I stepped inside, the air was heavy with the smell of mildew and dust, the scent of neglect. The pews were arranged in rows, but many were broken, some of them overturned. The floors creaked beneath my feet as I walked down the aisle, and the feeling of abandonment hung thick in the air. It felt like a place that had been left behind, forgotten by the world, its walls now speaking only to the wind that howled through the broken windows. The altar was at the far end of the room, draped in shadows. But what struck me, what made my heart skip a beat, was the cross. It was still lit. A small flame, flickering softly in the dim light, hovered at the center of the cross. It was faint, but it burned steadily, casting a soft golden glow against the dark room. I stopped in my tracks, staring at it. I hadn't expected this. I hadn't expected anything to still be running in a place like this. Certainly not something as symbolic and important as a cross. The church had been abandoned for years. That much I knew from the local records. The glass windows had long been broken, the roof had holes, and the structure itself was falling apart. Yet here, in the very heart of the church, was this tiny, steady flame. I couldn't look away. I felt an odd pull toward it, a force that seemed to draw me in. I moved forward slowly, my feet heavy against the worn floorboards, each step echoing in the vast silence of the space. As I got closer to the altar, the temperature seemed to drop, the chill in the air becoming more pronounced. The flame of the cross flickered again, and I realized that it wasn't just the rain or the wind that made the temperature feel colder. There was something in the air, something unseen, pressing in on me. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I reached the altar, and I felt the weight of the room settle around me, as if the building itself was watching. I knelt down in front of the altar, my hands instinctively reaching toward the flame. It was warm, but only just, and as I hovered my fingers near the cross, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone in this place. My breathing grew shallow as I stared at the flame, and a strange unease began to settle deep in my chest. There was something about the way it burned, not the flicker of a candle caught in the wind, but a steady, almost deliberate burn, as though it had been waiting for me. I leaned forward, my breath catching in my throat. But before I could touch the flame, I heard something, a whisper. It was soft at first, barely audible above the wind howling outside, but it was there. It came from somewhere behind me, in the far corner of the church, where the shadows seemed darkest. I froze, my pulse quickening, and I slowly turned around. The room was still, empty, save for the broken pews and the flickering light of the cross. The whisper came again, this time clearer, but still too faint to understand. I stood up, my legs shaky, and slowly turned toward the sound. There was nothing there, nothing but the remnants of the church, the broken windows and the walls crumbling with age. But the air felt different, heavy, thick with something I couldn't name. The whisper continued, but it didn't seem to be coming from any one direction. It was as though the church itself was speaking, the voices of long-forgotten souls lingering. In the air, the sound was growing louder now, more distinct. I could hear words, but they were foreign, unintelligible. My heart began to race, the silence of the room broken by the soft, rhythmic whispers that filled the space. I stumbled backward, toward the door, my breath coming faster, my mind screaming at me to leave, to get out. But as I turned to run, I saw it, the cross. The flame was flickering wildly now, dancing erratically, as if being pushed by some unseen force. The shadows in the room seemed to stretch and distort, and the whispers grew louder, overlapping with each other. They were all around me, pressing in. I could feel them in my ears, in my mind. Suddenly, the door slammed shut. The sound echoed through the empty church, loud and violent, as though the building itself had locked me inside. I spun around, my breath catching in my throat, and I rushed to the door, pulling at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. It was locked from the inside. I could feel the panic rising in my chest as the whispers intensified, filling the room with voices that no longer sounded like words. They were growling now, low and guttural, like the growl of something deep in the earth. I turned back to the altar, my eyes wide in terror. The flame of the cross had grown brighter, its glow illuminating the room, casting strange, elongated shadows across the walls. I stepped back, my hands trembling, unable to tear my eyes away from the cross. The whispers were everywhere now, swirling around me like a storm, and I could feel the temperature dropping, the cold settling deep in my bones. I tried to call out, but my voice was swallowed by the sound of the whispers. I stumbled toward the door again, my hands pounding against the wood, but nothing moved. The room was alive with noise, the air thick with something ancient, something I couldn't understand. And then, in the flickering light, I saw something, a figure, standing in the shadows near the door. It was tall, cloaked in darkness, its face hidden by the shadows. I could feel its presence, a weight pressing down on me. The figure didn't move, didn't speak, but I could feel it staring at me, as if waiting for me to acknowledge it. I didn't want to look. I didn't want to acknowledge the presence that was now in the room with me, but I couldn't help it. My gaze locked on the figure, and I felt the room shift around me, the air growing colder still. The whispering stopped. The figure stepped forward. But as it moved, I realized something. The flame on the cross, the steady, flickering light, had gone out. The room was plunged into darkness. And then I woke up. I was back in my car, parked at the edge of the forest, the rain still pouring outside. The morning light was breaking through the trees, casting long shadows on the ground. I sat there, my hands still gripping the steering wheel, unsure of how I had gotten back to the car, unsure of what had happened. The church was gone, and as I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still waiting for me, that the flame, the whispers, the figure, they hadn't disappeared. They had only been waiting for me to come back. And that, perhaps, was the most unsettling thing of all. The first time I visited the church, I felt it almost immediately, the heaviness in the air, the silence that was deeper than any place I had been before. I wasn't religious, not by any stretch, but there was something about that church that drew me in. It was old, its stone walls weathered by time, its roof sagging under years of exposure to the elements. It stood at the edge of a small village, hidden away from the main road, surrounded by trees that seemed to lean in closer, as if guarding it from the outside world. It had been a rough few months, and I needed to get away. I had heard about the church from a local, a woman who lived in the village nearby. She told me it was peaceful, a place where you could find solitude if you needed to clear your head. So, on a quiet Sunday afternoon, I decided to visit. The door creaked when I pushed it open, the sound echoing through the vast, empty space inside. The interior of the church was dim, lit only by the light filtering through stained glass windows, their colors muted by years of grime. The air smelled of dust and old wood, thick with age. The pews were worn, their surfaces cracked from years of use. I walked down the aisle, my footsteps muffled by the thick carpet that covered the floor. The silence was almost suffocating. It wasn't just the absence of noise. It was as if the silence itself had weight, pressing down on me. I wasn't sure what I expected, but it wasn't this oppressive quiet, this sense of stillness that seemed to hold the place in a kind of suspended animation. I stood for a moment in the center of the church, just taking it in. The ceiling was high, the wooden beams above weathered and dark. At the far end, the altar was simple, a few candles flickering softly in the dim light. I had come in search of peace, but the air felt too heavy, too thick with something I couldn't identify. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but there was something unsettling about the place, something that made me feel watched. I turned to leave, but stopped when I saw her. She was sitting near the front, her hands clasped in front of her, her head bowed low. Her presence was almost like a shadow, faint, barely noticeable at first. She was praying, her lips moving silently, her body still, her clothes simple but clean. I couldn't see her face clearly, but there was something familiar about her. A comfort, almost. But then, as I started to move closer, I heard it. A whisper, so soft, it almost blended into the silence, but I knew it was there. My name, Sarah. I stopped. I turned slowly, my heart rate quickening. The woman was still sitting there, her head bent, her body unmoving, but the whisper, it wasn't just the wind, wasn't just a trick of the air. It was a voice. Clear, faint, but unmistakable. It had called my name, and I knew it had come from her. My pulse raced as I tried to convince myself that it was just my imagination, that the isolation was getting to me, playing tricks on my mind. but the longer I stood there, the more the voice lingered. It wasn't loud, it wasn't demanding, but it was there, clear as day, soft and insistent. I took a hesitant step forward, my feet almost unwilling to move. She didn't notice me, didn't look up. Her eyes remained closed, her hands still pressed together in prayer, as if she was lost in some kind of trance. Asterisk Sarah. The whisper was louder now, more distinct, almost as if she had whispered it directly into my ear, even though she was still facing the altar. The sound of my name in that empty, cold space made the hairs on my neck stand up. I wanted to speak. To say something, ask her if she was talking to me, if she was even aware I was there, but my voice caught in my throat. I took another step forward, my heart pounding in my chest, my breaths shallow. The church felt colder now, the air more oppressive, the silence pressing in on me. I reached out, my hand trembling slightly, unsure of what I was doing. Was this a dream? Was I imagining the whole thing? Before I could reach her, she raised her head. Her face was pale, her features soft and kind, but there was something strange about her eyes. They were wide, unblinking, as though she was seeing something beyond me. And when she looked at me, it was as though she could see through me, like she wasn't really seeing me at all. "Do you hear them?" she asked, her voice soft, almost as if she were speaking to herself. But she wasn't. She was speaking to me. I froze, the words catching me off guard. "Hear what?" I managed to say, my voice barely above a whisper. She didn't respond at first. She just stared at me, her eyes distant, unblinking. The moment stretched, thick with silence, before she spoke again. "They've been calling your name for a long time." I felt my breath catch in my chest. Her words settled into my mind like cold stones sinking into water. My thoughts began to race. The voices, the whispers. The way I had felt watched. From the moment I entered the church. Was she talking about those voices? Was I hearing things? Or was there something more? Something else here. Her gaze didn't waver. She wasn't looking at me the way a person would look at someone in conversation. She was staring, as if she was seeing something just behind me, seeing something that I couldn't see. "They don't want you to leave," she murmured, her voice so quiet it was almost lost in the space between us. A chill ran down my spine, and I took a step back, my feet heavy with fear. I looked at the door, at the narrow exit, at the path I had entered from, but the door was no longer where I had seen it before. The shadows in the church had shifted somehow, rearranged themselves, and the space felt wrong, distorted. I looked back at the woman, but she wasn't there anymore. The chair she had been sitting in was empty, the seat pressed down as if she had just risen. The church felt colder now. The whispers had stopped, but the oppressive silence pressed against my ears, heavy and thick. I was alone, but I wasn't. I turned quickly, heading for the door, my heart hammering in my chest. But when I reached for the handle, it wouldn't turn. It was locked. I pulled harder, panic rising in my throat, but the door wouldn't open. I backed away, feeling trapped, my eyes darting around the room. The silence became unbearable. The air thickened. The walls of the church seemed to close in on me, pressing forward with an invisible weight. And then I heard it again. The whisper, barely audible, but unmistakable. Asterisk Sarah, come closer. The words were so clear, so close, that I could feel them in my bones. I couldn't move. My feet felt rooted to the floor. I didn't want to turn around, but I had to. I slowly turned, my heart pounding, my eyes searching the empty room. The woman was standing there again, her face expressionless, her eyes locked on mine. She wasn't moving, but she was there, standing at the altar, watching me. The door, the one I had just tried to open, was now wide open. The sound of the rain outside drifted in, mixing with the silence. The moment felt suspended in time, like the room was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I couldn't look away from her, and I couldn't move. The whisper echoed in my mind once more, but it was louder now. Asterisk, you belong here, Sarah. You've always belonged here. And that was when I understood. I wasn't in the church anymore. I had never left. The woman wasn't just praying for me. She was waiting for me to hear the whispers and come to her. And now, the door was open, waiting for me to step through. I don't know how long I stood there, caught in the space between fear and something darker. The whispers had stopped, but their echo remained, reverberating through the walls, through my thoughts, until I finally turned and walked toward the door. But when I stepped into the night, I didn't feel alone. The church was waiting, and I could hear them calling my name, even as I walked away. The rain had been coming down all afternoon, steady and relentless, drenching the earth and turning the roads into streams of muddy water. It was the kind of weather that made everything feel heavier, like the world itself was sinking into a gray, damp blanket. I had driven out to the old church in the countryside, having read about it online. An abandoned church, not far from the small town, said to be centuries old, its structure crumbling but still holding a strange, quiet beauty. It was a place that intrigued me, a place to explore, a place to find solitude. The church was located at the edge of the woods, far from the main road, hidden behind thick trees that towered above like silent sentinels. As I pulled up to the clearing where the church sat, I couldn't help but feel a strange sense of foreboding. The tall, pointed steeple cut sharply against the sky, the stone walls covered in ivy, and the air around the building was thick, like it hadn't been disturbed in years. I parked the car, got out, and walked to the door, the rain soaking through my coat as I approached. The door creaked as I pushed it open, and the first thing that hit me was the smell, musty, damp, like the air hadn't been stirred in ages. The inside was dim, the light from the overcast sky filtering through broken windows, casting strange shadows on the walls. The church was silent, save for the distant sound of raindrops falling from the roof and splashing against the stones outside. The wooden pews were old and decayed, some broken or overturned. The air felt heavy, thick with the weight of years, of neglect. The altar was at the far end, a simple stone structure, and above it, the stained glass windows were cracked, their colors faded by time. But what caught my attention, what made my breath catch in my chest, was the organ. It was a grand old instrument, covered in dust and cobwebs, its pipes stretching high toward the ceiling. It sat in a dark corner of the church, untouched, as if it had been forgotten. Yet, there it was, the faintest sound coming from the depths of the room. The organ was playing itself. It was soft at first, just a few notes drifting through the air, as if the wind had somehow pushed through the pipes. But as I stood there, frozen in place, it grew louder, more distinct. The notes were deep, rich, and haunting, a slow, mournful melody that seemed to fill the entire church. It wasn't a tune I recognized, but there was something about it that felt ancient, timeless, like it had been played 1,000 times before. The sound was so beautiful, so eerie, that I couldn't help but be drawn toward it. I moved closer, my footsteps soft against the wooden floor, careful not to disturb the stillness that seemed to envelop the room. The organ was playing on its own, the keys pressing down as if someone or something was guiding them. Yet there was no one sitting at the bench, no one in sight. Just the music, filling the church, reverberating through the stone walls, and sending a chill through my spine. As I stood there, mesmerized, I heard something else, a soft rustle behind me. At first, I thought it was just the wind, or maybe an animal that had snuck in, but then I heard it again. This time, it was louder, more distinct. A faint shuffle of footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from the far end of the church. I turned around, my heart pounding in my chest. The church was empty. I was sure of it. Yet, the sound continued, the steps drawing closer, until I felt a coldness settle in my bones. I wanted to call out, to ask if someone else was here, but my voice caught in my throat. The footsteps stopped, just behind me, and for a moment, the organ fell silent. The room seemed to hold its breath, and I stood there waiting for something, anything to happen. And then, I felt it. A presence. It was faint at first, like a shadow passing over me, but then it grew stronger, more defined. I wasn't alone in the church. There was someone else here. I could feel them, just behind me, but I couldn't see them. I turned slowly, my eyes scanning the room, searching for any sign of life, but there was nothing. The organ sat in the corner, silent now, the air heavy with stillness. I stepped back, my breath shallow, and reached for the door, but just as I did, the organ began to play again. This time, the melody was different. It was faster, more urgent, as though the music was trying to tell me something, trying to warn me. The notes echoed through the room, each one sending a jolt of fear through my chest. I felt the presence again, closer now, almost as if someone was standing right behind me. I spun around, my heart racing, but there was no one there. Just the empty church, the flickering light from the broken windows casting strange shadows on the walls. But I wasn't alone. I could feel it. I could feel someone watching me, waiting for me to make a move. The air grew colder, and I felt the walls closing in, the shadows growing deeper. The organ continued to play, the music now building into something frantic, desperate. And then, in the silence between the notes, I heard it. A whisper, soft at first, barely audible, but unmistakable. Asterisk, leave. Now. Asterisk, the voice was calm, distant, but it chilled me to my core. I didn't hesitate. I turned and ran, the sound of the organ chasing me, growing louder with each step I took. My feet were moving faster than I thought possible, my breath coming in ragged gasps. But no matter how fast I ran, the whispers followed, growing louder, more insistent. Asterisk, leave now, leave now. I reached the door and pulled it open, stepping out into the cold night, the rain still pouring down. The air outside was thick, with mist, the fog rising from the ground like tendrils reaching for me. I didn't look back. I couldn't. The organ stopped playing. I don't know what I felt more, relief or fear. I had no explanation for what had happened inside that church. I had no idea who or what had been playing the organ, or who had whispered my name. But as I walked away, the sound of the music still echoed in my mind, the haunting melody lingering long after the church had disappeared from view. To this day, I can't explain what happened there. But I know this much: the church was never empty, and whatever played the organ, whatever whispered my name, is still waiting in the darkness. I haven't been back, and I never will. I had always been drawn to old places, especially abandoned ones. There's something about them, the history that lingers in the air, the silence that speaks volumes, the feeling of stepping into a world that's long been forgotten. That's why I ended up in the church that day. It wasn't part of any tour, nor did I seek it out on a map. It was more of an impulse. I had been staying in a small village for a few days, needing a break from the noise of the city, and I heard about the old church at the edge of town. It had been abandoned for as long as anyone could remember, the locals saying it was cursed, that no one who had tried to restore it had ever succeeded. Some believed the church had been left standing as a kind of memorial, but to what, no one knew. I had to see it for myself. The church was perched on a hill, surrounded by thick trees and dense underbrush, a place that felt cut off from the rest of the world. The path leading to it was narrow and overgrown, with thorny vines that grabbed at my legs as I made my way up. The building itself was worn, its stone walls cracked and weathered by years of exposure to the elements. The roof had holes in it, and the tall steeple was tilted at an odd angle, like it had been trying to escape the earth's gravity. Despite its dilapidated state, there was an eerie beauty to it, as if it was clinging to life by sheer will. When I reached the door, it was ajar, the wood warped and splintered. The moment I stepped inside, the air shifted. It was cold, colder than I expected, and the smell of mildew and rot hit me like a physical blow. The interior was dark, with only a sliver of light filtering through the cracked stained glass windows, casting muted colors onto the stone floor. The silence inside was absolute, broken only by the soft creaking of the floorboards beneath my feet as I ventured further. I don't know what I expected, but it certainly wasn't this. The church was largely untouched by time, save for the decay. The pews were still in place, though many had been overturned, their cushions torn and tattered. The altar at the far end of the room was simple but imposing, a stone slab with a faded tapestry draped over it. It looked like it had once been a place of reverence, but now it felt like an abandoned shrine to something forgotten. I took a deep breath, trying to shake off the unease creeping up my spine. The place felt heavy, as if it carried a weight of grief or despair that had soaked into the stone walls over the years. I moved deeper into the church, my footsteps echoing in the silence. That's when I saw it. It was a small room off to the side, barely noticeable unless you were looking for it. The door creaked open with little effort, revealing a narrow, dimly lit space. Inside, there were no pews, no benches, just walls that seemed to close in around me. But the most striking thing was what I saw written on the walls: prayers. But not like any prayers I had ever seen before. They were scrawled in thick, dark red lettering, curling along the walls in chaotic, frantic strokes. I took a step closer. my breath hitching as I tried to make sense of what I was looking at. The prayers seemed personal, almost like someone had poured their very soul into them. The words were broken, incomplete, as if they were written in haste, but there was no mistaking the emotion behind them. Each prayer was different, yet all of them shared the same urgency, the same raw desperation. I couldn't understand all of them, but I could feel the weight of them, the fear, the pleading. Some of the prayers seemed to ask for forgiveness, others for protection. One was simply a name, over and over again. Please, save them. But what struck me the most wasn't the content of the prayers themselves, but the way they were written. It wasn't ink, it was blood. I stepped back, my heart racing, my pulse quickening in my ears. The words were too vivid, too dark, and I could smell the coppery scent of it in the air, even though I knew there was no reason I should be able to. I touched the wall gently, half expecting my fingers to come away sticky. But they didn't. There was no physical trace of blood, just the sickly reminder of what it had been, of what had soaked into the very stone, the very foundation of the church. I stumbled backward, my breath shallow, my hands shaking. The room felt smaller now, as if the walls were closing in, the air growing heavier. I turned, desperate to escape, but as I reached the door, I froze. There, in the far corner of the room, was a figure. At first, I thought it was my mind playing tricks on me, the shadows in the dim light creating an illusion. But as I blinked, it didn't go away. It was a figure, hunched, its back to me, standing still. It wasn't human, not in the way I expected. It was too still, too silent. The air around it felt colder, and I could feel the weight of its presence, pressing against me. I couldn't see its face, just the outline of its figure, dark and unnatural against the dim light of the room. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. I wanted to run, but my legs felt like lead, frozen in place. The figure didn't move, didn't even acknowledge me. It was as though it wasn't aware of my presence, or maybe it was waiting for me to leave. I couldn't stand it any longer. I ran. I bolted from the room, my feet pounding against the stone floor, my heart thundering in my chest. The sound of my footsteps echoed through the church, but when I reached the main doors, they wouldn't open. The handle was cold, unyielding, like the door had been sealed shut for years. I yanked at it again, panic rising, and then, just as suddenly as it had closed, the door swung open, and I stumbled into the rain-soaked air outside. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I ran all the way to the car, my breath ragged in my chest, my mind racing with the image of the blood-soaked walls, the figure that stood waiting in the darkness. The prayers had been written in blood, but it wasn't just the blood that haunted me. It was the question. Who had prayed like that, and why had they done it? I drove away as fast as I could, not looking back, the sound of the rain filling the silence. The church faded behind me, but the image of those prayers, the blood and the figure that never left. I don't know who had written them. I don't know who had been there before me, or why they left those prayers behind. But I know one thing. There is something in that church, something dark, something that waits for those who venture in. I haven't been back, and I don't plan to. But I still hear the whispers sometimes, when the wind is just right, or when I close my eyes in the dark. And every time I do, I wonder if someone, or something, is still praying. I didn't expect anything unusual when I entered the old church. In fact, I didn't even intend to stay long. I had come to the small town for business, a quick stop to check out some local art galleries, and I had heard about the church from a few locals who mentioned it in passing. They described it as quaint, ancient, a place to visit if you wanted to feel connected to history. The church was tucked at the end of a narrow street, behind a few tall buildings, its stone walls cracked by years of weathering. From the outside, it looked like any other old church I had seen, weathered, its windows dull from years of neglect, the spire stretching high into the sky. But as soon as I stepped inside, something shifted. The air was thick, musty with age, and the dim light that filtered through the stained glass windows seemed to bend, casting strange shadows along the stone floors. It was quieter than any place I had ever been, not the kind of quiet that you get in a room full of people, but a deep, heavy silence that seemed to stretch into every corner, filling the space with an almost palpable weight. The church itself was ancient, like a relic of another time. The pews were worn, their wood scratched and chipped, and the altar at the far end was simple, draped in cloths that had faded to pale shades over the years. The high ceilings arched above, but the room felt small, as if the weight of the stone pressed down on me from every direction. The air, thick with dust and old incense, seemed to hold memories, and as I wandered down the aisle, it almost felt like I was walking in someone else's dream, a dream that wasn't quite finished. I didn't plan on exploring much. I had been to old churches before, and there was something in their silence, in their age, that always made me uneasy. But as I walked toward the altar, I noticed her. She was standing in the back corner, near a small door that led into a dark hallway, a figure draped in a long, simple robe, her face obscured by a hood. She was motionless, and I couldn't tell if she was simply lost in prayer, or if she was waiting for someone. The stillness about her seemed to pull me in. She was out of place, like a shadow in a room full of forgotten memories. I hesitated, unsure whether to approach, but something about the way she stood there, so quiet and still, made me feel like I had to. Maybe it was the isolation of the church, or perhaps my own curiosity, but I found myself walking toward her. As I drew closer, she finally moved, lifting her head just slightly, her face still hidden. "Are you here for the tour?" she asked. Softly, her voice calm, almost too calm for someone standing in a place that felt so alive with quiet. I nodded, though I hadn't heard anything about a tour. Yes, I was just passing through. I didn't realize people still came here. She gave a faint smile, the kind that didn't quite reach her eyes. "The church is always open. If you'd like, I can show you a few things you might not find on your own." There was something odd about her tone, something that I couldn't place. It wasn't inviting, nor was it cold. It was neutral, almost too neutral, as though she had said those words 1,000 times. But I didn't feel threatened, not exactly. Something in me, some curiosity I couldn't shake, pushed me forward. "Sure," I said, stepping closer to her. "I'd like that." She gestured toward the door behind her, the one I hadn't noticed before. It was small, almost hidden in the shadows, tucked away at the back of the church. "This way," she said. I followed her through the door, into a narrow, dimly lit hallway. The air grew colder, and the scent of mildew was more noticeable here. More pungent. The stone walls were rough, uneven, like the space had been carved out over time by hands that had forgotten what they were building. The hallway was empty, save for a few old wooden crates piled against the walls, and the faint creak of the floorboards beneath our feet. She moved quickly, as if she knew the place well, leading me through the maze of corridors. The hallways twisted and turned, and I began to lose my sense of direction. We passed small rooms, their doors slightly ajar, revealing nothing but dust and shadow within. Then she stopped in front of a wooden door. It was old, the wood worn and cracked, the brass handle tarnished with age. "This is the sacristy," she said quietly, her voice barely audible over the sound of my own breath. "Few are allowed inside, but for you, I'll make an exception." I didn't know why I felt uneasy, but I did. The sacristy, I knew it was where sacred objects were stored, where priests would prepare for services. But there was something about the way she spoke, the way her eyes flickered toward the door, that made my skin prickle with discomfort. She opened the door slowly, and I followed her inside. The room was small, just enough space for the altar, some shelves lined with old books, and a few lit candles. The walls were adorned with tapestries, worn and faded from years of exposure to the damp air. But what struck me immediately was the cross hanging on the far wall. It was large, made of dark wood, and in the center of the cross was a small, delicate candle, flickering with a steady flame. But it wasn't the cross that caught my attention, not entirely. It was what was on the walls. The walls were covered in old, faded prayers, their ink smudged and running, as though the words had once been carefully written but had long since begun to deteriorate. The prayers themselves were odd, strange in a way I couldn't put my finger on. They weren't in any language I recognized, but the feeling they gave off was unmistakable. They were desperate, pleading, almost frantic. I moved closer to one of the walls, my curiosity getting the better of me. But as I reached out to touch the paper, my hand froze. There was something on the wall, something that wasn't just ink. It was blood. The words, once written in black ink, were now streaked with something dark and red, dripping down the pages like a stain that had been left for too long. I recoiled, my stomach twisting, but I couldn't look away. There was more blood, more prayers, all over the walls, covering everything in sight. And in the center of it all, directly beneath the cross, were two words written in the darkest, thickest blood. Asterisk, leave now. I turned to the woman, my heart racing, but she was no longer standing in front of me. She was further inside the room, her back to me, her hands clasped in front of her. She was whispering something, too softly for me to hear, her voice blending with the faint rustling sound of the wind outside. I wanted to ask her what was going on, but the words stuck in my throat. The air had grown heavier, thicker, and I could feel a strange pressure building in my chest. I stepped back, my hand brushing against the wall, and it came away wet. I looked down at my fingers, and there it was, blood. My skin went cold. I hadn't touched anything that would leave such a mark, but there it was. It wasn't mine. I turned to leave the room, my mind spinning, but as I reached for the door, it slammed shut with a force that made me jump. I tried the handle, but it wouldn't budge. Panic began to rise in my chest as I pressed against the door, feeling the sweat on my palms. The woman turned, slowly, her face now illuminated by the dim candlelight, and for the first time, I saw her clearly. Her eyes were hollow, dark circles beneath them, and her mouth was twisted into a faint smile, but it wasn't a comforting smile. It was the smile of someone who knew something I didn't, someone who had been waiting for me to understand. She spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. "You shouldn't have come." The cross behind her flickered, the candle's flames sputtering and growing dimmer. The room, once still, now felt alive, the walls pressing in on me, the blood-streaked prayers pulling me closer to them. I could feel the weight of the silence pushing down, and I knew I wasn't supposed to be here. But now I couldn't leave. The door was locked, and the whispers were closing in around me, growing louder, more insistent. The sacristy wasn't just a room, it was a warning, and I had ignored it. I had always been drawn to abandoned places. There's something deeply unsettling, yet strangely peaceful, about standing in the remnants of something once lived in, once loved, and now left behind. I had heard about the old church in the small town on the outskirts of the city through a friend, and though I wasn't religious, I couldn't help but feel a pull toward it. The church had stood for centuries, its tall stone walls weathered and worn, its windows cracked, and its bell tower rising high above the village like a silent sentinel. It had been closed to the public for years, the community having long since moved on, but there were rumors about the bell. The bell, they said, rang on its own. I wasn't sure what to make of it, but the curiosity gnawed at me. I decided to visit one quiet, overcast afternoon, hoping to get a glimpse of this church, and perhaps to satisfy the uneasy feeling that had crept into my mind every time I heard the bell's name. The town was small, sleepy even, and as I drove through its narrow streets, it felt like I was stepping back in time. There was a thick fog in the air, swirling around the edges of the buildings, and the distant sound of the church bell echoed. In the background, faint but constant. I parked my car near the church, the stones underfoot slick with moisture from the fog. The church stood at the end of the road, its Gothic spires reaching toward the sky like fingers outstretched in prayer. It was more imposing up close, the tall, dark stone walls pressing against the gray sky. I walked toward the heavy wooden door of the church, my footsteps muffled by the mist, the air cool and damp against my skin. The door was slightly ajar, an invitation, or perhaps a warning, but I pushed it open and stepped inside. The air in the church was cold, thick with the scent of dust and mildew. It was as though time had stopped here, as if the world outside had ceased to exist, leaving only this place to linger in its own quiet isolation. The interior was dim, the high windows letting in little light, their stained glass faded and cracked. The pews were old, some overturned, some broken, and the altar at the far end was simple, draped in dusty cloths that had long since lost their vibrancy. I made my way toward the front of the church, my footsteps echoing in the stillness. The walls were covered in peeling paint, the woodwork darkened by age and neglect. But as I passed the center aisle, I heard it, the faintest sound, a bell. It wasn't the loud, clear tolling of a bell ringing at the hour, like I had expected, but a soft, distant chime, almost like a whisper. It came from above, from the tower, though I couldn't see how the bell could be ringing on its own. The tower seemed empty, just an old wooden structure rising high above, its windows dark and silent. I froze, my heart skipping a beat, the sound sending a chill down my spine. The bell rang again, the sound softer this time, but unmistakable. I looked up toward the tower, the beam of light from the high windows casting long shadows across the room. But the bell tower was still. No one was up there. The church was abandoned, after all. There couldn't be anyone inside, not at this hour. Yet, the sound of the bell continued, faint but persistent, echoing in the thick air. A sense of unease settled in the pit of my stomach. I walked slowly toward the tower, drawn inexplicably toward it. The closer I got, the more the sound of the bell seemed to grow, filling the air with its soft chimes, though the tower above me remained still, empty. The door to the tower was slightly open. I hadn't noticed it before, hidden behind a dark wooden pillar, and I hesitated for a moment. The bell rang again, louder now, though still distant. It was almost as though it was calling me, urging me to go up, to find out what was causing it. But something about the sound unsettled me. It wasn't normal. The bell should have been silent, but it wasn't. I pushed the door open. Inside, the stairway to the tower was narrow, winding, and steep, the wooden steps creaking underfoot as I ascended. The air was colder here, and the smell of rot and decay grew stronger with each step. The silence around me grew heavier as I climbed higher, the faint chimes of the bell now replaced with the sound of my breath, quick and shallow, and my footsteps echoing against the stone walls. At the top, the door to the bell tower was cracked open. I reached for the handle, my fingers trembling slightly as I pushed it open. The room inside was dim, lit only by the faint glow coming through a small, broken window. The bell itself hung in the center of the tower, its metal dark and aged, the ropes long since frayed. It was silent now, but I could still feel the weight of it, the presence of the bell, as though it had never truly stopped ringing. I stepped forward, my gaze searching the room, but I couldn't see anything unusual. There was no one here. The bell was still, its great mass hanging silently above me. Yet, the air in the tower felt heavy, thick with something I couldn't name, like the room was holding its breath. The silence around me grew, thick and suffocating. And then, just as I turned to leave, I saw it, a figure. It was standing in the far corner of the room, shrouded in shadow, its features hidden by the darkness. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I couldn't see its face, couldn't make out anything about it except the faint outline of a figure. Standing perfectly still, it was as though it had always been there, waiting, its presence pressing in on me from all sides. My breath caught in my throat, and I took a step back, my hand instinctively reaching for the door. But before I could move, the figure stepped forward. The movement was slow, deliberate, as though it was made of the very shadows in the room. And then, it spoke. Asterisk, it's not time yet. The voice was faint, barely a whisper, but it reverberated in my chest, the words somehow both calm and commanding. My legs went weak beneath me, and I stumbled back, my hands shaking as I reached for the door again. The figure didn't move, didn't say anything more, but I could feel its presence, feel its gaze on me, even though I couldn't see its face. I didn't wait to see if it would move again. I bolted from the tower, my footsteps heavy and panicked as I descended the stairs. The sound of the bell, once faint, now echoed in my mind, a steady, unrelenting chime that seemed to follow me as I left the tower, as if the church itself was calling me back. I didn't look back as I rushed out of the church, the door slamming behind me with a force that rattled the air. The bell didn't stop ringing, its chimes now filling the air around me, louder than before, as if it were calling out to me. The rain was falling harder now, but the sound of the bell seemed to drown it out, filling my ears with its call. I don't know what I saw in the tower that day, or what it was that spoke to me, but I know one thing: I never went back to that church. And every time I hear a bell ring, no matter where I am, I can't shake the feeling that it's still calling me, still waiting. The rain had been relentless all day, and by the time I arrived at the church, the streets were slick with water, the fog thick enough to obscure the few streetlights that flickered in the distance. I wasn't sure why I had come. It wasn't something I planned. It was more of an impulse, a strange pull I couldn't resist. I had been wandering the town all evening, walking aimlessly through the quiet streets, until I found myself standing in front of the church. The tall, weathered spire loomed above, its outline barely visible in the dark sky. The building itself was old, much older than anything around it, its stone walls cracked and covered in creeping ivy. The door was slightly ajar, as though it was waiting for me. I hadn't seen a soul all day. The town felt abandoned, suffocated by the heavy rain, but there was something about the church that seemed alive, almost as if it was calling to me. There was no real reason for me to be here, no occasion, no purpose, but something inside me told me to enter, so I did. The door creaked as I pushed it open, the sound echoing in the empty space. The inside of the church was dark, save for the faint light that leaked in through the stained glass windows, casting muted colors on the stone floors. The smell of incense and mildew was thick in the air, and the sound of the rain against the roof created a steady, rhythmic beat that seemed to lull the entire room into a strange kind of stillness. The air was heavy, thick with something I couldn't quite name. It was as if the space itself held its breath, waiting for something, or someone. I stepped further inside, my footsteps muffled by the thick carpet that stretched the length of the aisle. The pews were empty, some of them crooked, or overturned, their wood worn with age. At the far end of the room, the altar was simple, nothing extravagant, just a stone table covered with a dark cloth. But what caught my attention most of all was the windows. The stained glass windows that lined the walls of the church were large, their colors dulled with time, their edges chipped and cracked. But as I looked closer, something strange happened. The rain had stopped, but the light from outside was still dim, the kind of eerie glow that comes from a moon hidden behind thick clouds. And then I saw it. The windows. They were bleeding. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me, but as I stared at the glass, I could see the faintest trickle of something dark running down the edges of the panes, as though the windows themselves were crying. The light that passed through the glass seemed to twist, flicker, and bleed in the strangest way, casting deep blood-red hues across the floor and the walls. I felt my breath catch in my throat, my heartbeat quickening as I stepped forward, trying to make sense of it. It wasn't water, it wasn't paint, it was something darker, something that looked too much like blood for my mind to ignore. I looked around, half expecting to see someone else in the church. Someone who could explain what was happening. But I was alone. The pews were empty. The altar was untouched. The place felt like a forgotten dream, a space suspended in time. And I was just another lost soul wandering through it. I moved closer to the altar, my eyes fixed on the windows, unable to tear my gaze away. The blood-like substance on the glass seemed to pulse, like it was alive, moving slowly down the windows in irregular patterns. The colors of the stained glass, the deep reds, the dark blues, and the pale yellows, now looked sickly, as though the light that had once filled them with beauty was now corrupted by something darker. I didn't know what to think, didn't know if I should run or stay, but I couldn't leave. The air in the church was thick now, like it was pressing in on me, pushing me toward the altar, urging me to come closer. And then I heard it. A whisper. It was faint at first, so soft that I wasn't sure I had even heard it. But it came again, this time clearer, closer. It was a voice, a low, raspy voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Asterisk, come closer. I froze. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and I could feel the weight of the voice pressing against me, pulling me forward, toward the altar, toward the source of the strange light that filled the church. My heart was racing now, my pulse hammering in my chest, but I couldn't move. I couldn't turn away. The voice was calling me, coaxing me, and despite the fear that gripped my chest, I took a step forward. As I moved closer to the altar, I noticed something else. The air around me had grown colder, the temperature dropping rapidly, like a chill was settling into my bones. The blood on the windows seemed to intensify, growing darker, more vivid with each passing second. And the whisper, it was growing. Louder, almost urgent now. Asterisk, come closer. It's waiting. I was standing at the foot of the altar now, my breath shallow, the room around me closing in. I didn't understand what was happening, didn't understand why I was still standing here, drawn to this place, to the voice that seemed to call my name from somewhere just beyond my reach. And then, something moved in the corner of the room. I turned quickly, but there was nothing there. Just the empty pews, the shadows stretching long across the floor. The voice came again, but this time, it wasn't a whisper. It was a scream. The windows above me flashed with a bright, fiery light, and I could feel the warmth of it on my face. Though it wasn't natural, it was a sickly, unnatural heat, like the blood itself had come to life and was burning, searing through the church, through everything around me. The walls seemed to shake, the building groaning as if it was alive, breathing with a force that I couldn't understand. And then, I saw it. A figure, standing in the shadows near the back of the church. It wasn't human, or at least, it didn't look human. It was tall, too tall, its limbs long and twisted, its face hidden in the darkness. Its body was obscured by the shadows, but I could feel its eyes on me, watching, waiting. The voice no longer a whisper, but a command filled the air, wrapping around me like a vice. Asterisk, come to me. I couldn't move. My legs felt like lead, my body frozen, my mind screaming at me to run, but I couldn't tear myself away from the figure, from the presence that had filled the church. I was paralyzed, unable to look away, unable to breathe. The light from the stained glass windows flickered as though it were dying, as though it were being consumed by something darker, something ancient. And then, just as suddenly as it had all begun, the church fell silent. The blood on the windows had stopped. The light that had bled from the glass was gone. The air was still colder now, but the weight of the church's presence had lifted, leaving behind a strange emptiness. I stood there, alone, my mind racing, my breath coming in quick gasps. The door, the only way out, was still in front of me, but I couldn't move. I couldn't leave. I don't know how long I stood there, caught between fear and curiosity. I don't know how much time passed before I found the strength to leave, but when I finally turned to walk toward the door, the whisper came again, louder than before. Asterisk, you shouldn't leave. I reached for the door, my hand trembling, but as I pulled it open, the church was silent again. The rain outside was steady, but the air felt different now, less oppressive, more like the world outside had returned. I stepped out of the church, my feet unsteady on the wet ground, and when I looked back, the building seemed to fade into the fog, its towering spire disappearing into the mist. The bell had stopped ringing, the light had stopped bleeding, and I was left with the strange, hollow feeling that something had followed me out. Something still waits inside that church. I can feel it, lingering just behind me, always there, always calling, and now I wonder if I'll ever be able to escape it. It was supposed to be a quick stop. I had been traveling for hours, the road long and winding, cutting through dense forests and rolling hills. The kind of drive that wears on you, endless stretches of asphalt. The low hum of the engine, the landscape passing by in a blur of green and brown. I wasn't expecting much, just a place to rest, maybe stretch my legs. So when I saw the sign for the old church on the side of the road, I decided to pull in. It was a small, unassuming place, surrounded by trees, its tall spire rising from the hill like a quiet sentinel. The sky was overcast, the air thick with the promise of rain, and something about the church seemed to call to me. A place to rest, to gather my thoughts for a moment. I parked near the front, and as I stepped out of the car, the quiet struck me. There was no sound, not even the usual hum of insects or the rustle of the wind through the trees, just an eerie stillness that felt out of place in the world around it. The church itself was old, its stone walls covered in ivy, the wooden doors dark and worn by age. The windows, though intact, were streaked with grime, casting the interior in shadow. There was something about the building that made it feel almost forgotten, like it had been abandoned by time itself. But the doors were open. I hesitated for a moment, standing at the threshold, the cool air of the church inviting me in. Something in me told me to turn around, to get back in the car and continue driving, but I couldn't. Instead, I took a step inside, the sound of my shoes echoing in the vast emptiness. The interior was dim, lit only by the faint light filtering through the stained glass windows. The air smelled of old wood and dust, the scent of neglect that seemed to cling to every corner of the room. The pews were worn, some overturned, some broken, and the stone floor was cold beneath my feet. The altar stood at the far end, simple and unadorned, and the cross above it was dark, almost as if it had been forgotten. The silence in the church was profound, oppressive, and I felt a chill run down my spine as I walked further inside. As I moved toward the back, I noticed the confessional. It stood in a shadowed alcove, its wood dark and polished, the small lattice window obscured by the curtains that had long since lost their color. I wasn't sure why I found myself drawn to it, but something about the confessional intrigued me. I hadn't seen one in years, and the idea of entering it, even just to sit in silence, felt oddly comforting in the midst of the emptiness of the church. Maybe it was the feeling of isolation, of being alone with my thoughts, that made it seem appealing. I approached slowly, my footsteps muffled on the stone floor. As I reached the confessional, I hesitated again, looking around the empty church. But then, I heard it, a sound, barely audible, but unmistakable, a whisper, soft and breathy, as if someone was speaking from inside the confessional. "Come in," it said, the words so quiet that I almost thought I had imagined them. I froze, my heart thudding in my chest. I didn't know why, but I felt an overwhelming urge to obey. The whisper had come from within the confessional, but the door was closed. The small lattice window was dark, its curtains drawn tight. There was no one there, and yet I could hear it again. Come in. It's safe. I don't know why, but I pushed the door open. The inside of the confessional was dim, the small space illuminated only by the faint light from the room outside. The walls were lined with wood, worn smooth by years of use. There was a small bench on one side, and a heavy silence filled the air. My heart was pounding now, my thoughts racing. But the whisper came again, soft and inviting. "Sit down," it said, the voice sweet, almost comforting. But there was something unsettling in its calmness. Something in the way the words lingered. In the air, like they were reaching out to touch me. I sat down on the bench, my hands clammy, my breath shallow. I didn't know why I was there, why I felt compelled to be here, but I couldn't turn away now. I leaned back against the wall of the confessional, trying to steady myself, but the room felt colder than it had before, the shadows deeper, and the silence heavier. And then, the whisper came again. You've been lost for so long. You don't have to be anymore." I felt a jolt in my chest. The words hit me harder than I expected. They echoed in my mind, and I felt my pulse quicken. There was something wrong about this, something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. The room around me felt suddenly smaller, the air thick with an unseen weight. My breath caught in my throat, and I tried to stand, to leave, but I couldn't move. My body felt heavy, like it was frozen in place. I looked toward the lattice window, and I could feel the presence on the other side. Someone was there, someone watching. And then, slowly, the voice spoke again. "I'm here. Don't be afraid." I wasn't sure if I was hearing the voice inside my head or if it was coming from the other side of the confessional. But it was there, undeniably real. I could feel it in my bones, a presence that seemed to fill the room, press against my chest, making it hard to breathe. I looked toward the window again, my heart racing. And that's when I saw it. A figure, standing just behind the lattice, but its face was hidden in shadow. I couldn't make out its features, couldn't see its eyes, but I could feel it looking at me. It wasn't human. It didn't feel human. The darkness behind the lattice seemed to shift, as though it was alive, as though it was watching, waiting. I wanted to scream, to get up and run, but I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. The figure didn't speak, didn't make a sound, but I could feel its presence pressing against me. The whisper came again, soft and soothing. Asterisk, you've been searching for so long, but you've already found it. The words were no longer comforting. They were suffocating, pressing against my chest, filling my mind with 1,000 thoughts I couldn't understand. I tried to stand up again, to open the door, but it wouldn't budge. I was trapped in the small confessional with this presence, this thing that wasn't supposed to be here. The shadows deepened around me, closing in, and I could feel the weight of the room pressing down on me. And then the voice came, not in a whisper anymore, but clear and loud, echoing through the small space. Asterisk, come closer. I finally broke free of the paralysis, but when I moved, I couldn't leave. My hand reached for the door, but it was locked. I slammed my body against the wooden door, trying to force my way out, but it wouldn't open. I looked back at the lattice, and the figure was gone, but the air felt wrong. The silence was suffocating, and I could still feel the presence there, just beyond the door. The whisper came again, quieter now, but still just as clear. Asterisk, you've already found your way here. You don't need to leave. I don't know how long I sat there, trapped in that small space, but eventually, I managed to open the door and stumble out of the confessional, my legs weak, my heart still pounding in my chest. I didn't look back. I didn't dare to. I ran out of the church, the rain still falling in steady sheets, the fog thick around me, but I didn't feel safe. I didn't feel free. The presence from the confessional, the voice, the figure, it stayed with me, lingering in the back of my mind like it was calling me to return. I haven't gone back to the church, and I don't think I ever will. But sometimes, late at night, when the wind howls outside or the rain falls too heavily, I still hear that whisper in my ear, the voice calling me back. And I wonder, sometimes, if I ever really left at all. I don't know why I decided to visit the church that night. There was no particular reason for it. No event, no need. I was just passing through the small town after a long day of driving, the kind of quiet, forgotten place that felt stuck in time. The kind of town where nothing ever seemed to change. It was late, and the rain had been coming down hard for hours, but something about the sight of the church in the distance caught my attention. The tall spire rising above the town, the silhouette of the building against the darkened sky. It looked almost inviting. I wasn't religious. In fact, I wasn't sure why I even felt drawn to it, but I couldn't help myself. I pulled my car over to the side of the road and walked toward the church, the rain soaking into my coat as I made my way through the wet streets. The church loomed ahead, its stone walls dark and weathered, the windows darkened by grime and the years that had passed. The doors, wooden and creaky, were slightly ajar. I don't remember thinking it was strange. I just pushed the door open and stepped inside. The air inside the church was thick and heavy, the smell of old wood and dust filling my lungs. It was dark, with only a few flickering candles casting faint shadows on the walls. The silence was almost suffocating, broken only by the distant sound of the rain outside and the occasional creak of the wooden pews. It was cold in there, much colder than I had expected, but the stillness was oddly peaceful, as though time had stopped in the room. I wandered further inside, looking around. The high ceilings of the church were covered in intricate carvings, but the details were difficult to make out in the dim light. The stained glass windows were faded, some of them cracked, letting in only faint streaks of light from outside. The altar at the front was simple, but there was something almost comforting about it. The candles at the altar flickered, their flames small but steady. It was at that moment I noticed something strange. The small basin of holy water by the entrance. It was placed near the door, as though waiting for someone to dip their fingers into it. Something about it caught my attention, though I couldn't say exactly what. There was an odd pull, a need to touch it, as if it was calling to me. I approached the small stone basin, the water inside glimmering faintly in the candlelight. Without really thinking, I reached my hand toward it. The moment my fingers touched the water, a searing pain shot through my hand, unlike anything I had ever felt. It wasn't just discomfort, it was a burning, an intense heat that felt like fire itself. I yanked my hand back, gasping in shock. My fingers felt like they had been burned, and for a moment, I just stood there, staring at the holy water, unable to understand what had just happened. The pain didn't subside. It lingered, spreading through my hand, my palm still feeling as if it had been scorched. I looked at my fingers, expecting to see blisters or red marks from the heat, but there was nothing. No marks, no burns, no sign of injury. But the sensation of the burn, it was still there, deep and raw, as if something inside me had been. Awakened, I stepped back, my heart pounding in my chest. The church felt suddenly different, as though the air had shifted around me. The silence, once peaceful, now felt oppressive, suffocating. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to stretch longer, and I could feel my breath quicken, my body instinctively moving toward the door. But then, I heard it, a whisper. It was faint at first, so soft that I wasn't sure if it was the wind or if I was imagining it. But then it came again, louder this time, almost as if it was being spoken right next to me. You shouldn't have touched it. I froze. The voice was low, a whisper that seemed to crawl under my skin, filling my mind with unease. I looked around, my eyes darting to the pews, to the altar, but there was no one else in the church. The door was still open, the rain still falling outside, but the presence inside the church now felt thick, pressing in on me from all sides. I stepped back, my legs unsteady beneath me, and turned to leave. But as I reached for the door, I heard it. Again, a low whisper, clear this time, cutting through the silence. It's too late now. I turned quickly, my heart in my throat, but the church was empty. I was alone. Still, the presence of something unseen, something watching me, hung in the air. The strange pull of the holy water, the burning sensation on my fingers, and the whispering voice. It felt like something ancient, something old and powerful that had just woken up. I stepped outside, the rain hitting my face like cold needles. I didn't look back. I didn't want to. The pain in my hand had subsided, but the unease lingered, crawling up my spine, making every step feel heavier. I've never returned to that church, but sometimes, when I'm alone, when the house is quiet and the rain falls just right, I can still feel the burn on my hand, a lingering heat that never quite fades. And sometimes, I hear the whispers again, faint and distant, but unmistakable. It's too late now. I don't know what I touched that night, or what it was that responded to me. But I know this: something in that church is still waiting. And it doesn't forget. I've never been the superstitious type. I don't believe in ghosts, spirits, or any of that paranormal stuff. I'm a skeptic, plain and simple. But that night in the old church, I don't know what happened. All I know is that something was following me. Something I couldn't see, but could feel every time I turned a corner. I had been driving through the countryside, taking a detour off the main road to explore a town I'd never visited before. The town was small, sleepy even, and not much. More than a few scattered houses and a couple of streets. It was the kind of place where time seemed to slow down, where the world felt quieter. The sun had already set by the time I arrived, and the air was thick with the smell of rain that was yet to come. The first thing that caught my eye was the church at the end of the main street. Its spire rising high above the surrounding buildings, silhouetted against the dimming sky. The church was old, weathered, the stone walls cracked and covered in creeping vines. It stood there like a relic from another time, forgotten but still present. I parked my car near the church, curious to take a look. I had no plans to stay long, just a quick walk inside, a peek at the stained glass windows, and then back to the road. The heavy wooden door was slightly ajar, and despite the eerie silence around the place, it seemed inviting. I stepped inside, the door creaking behind me. The church was dark, lit only by the faint glow of candles on the altar. The air was cool and musty, and the smell of old wood filled my lungs. The silence was absolute, the kind of silence that presses in on you, makes you acutely aware of every breath you take, every sound you make. The floor beneath my feet was cold and worn, the old pews arranged in neat rows, some of them tilted, others broken. The stained glass windows were dim, the light from outside barely filtering through the layers of grime. The place felt abandoned. And yet, there was something about it that made me hesitate. I walked down the aisle slowly, my footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. The light from the candles flickered in the stillness, casting long shadows across the stone floor. I reached the altar, where a simple wooden cross stood at the center, but as I stood there, something felt off. The air was heavier now, more oppressive. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. My skin prickled with unease, and I turned, half expecting to see someone standing in the doorway. But the church was empty. It had been empty when I walked in, and it was still empty now. I turned back toward the altar, but that's when I heard it. A faint shuffle of footsteps. I froze. The sound was distant, coming from somewhere behind me. My heart skipped a beat. I looked around, half expecting to see someone moving in the shadows, but there was no one. The church was still silent. I waited for a moment, straining my ears, but there was nothing. I told myself it was nothing, just the sound of the building settling, the wind outside pushing through the cracks in the walls. It had to be, but as I continued walking, I heard it again, the shuffle. This time, closer. My pulse quickened, and I turned quickly, my eyes scanning the empty pews, but nothing. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was moving just behind me, following my every step. I kept walking, moving toward the back of the church, but now the feeling was unmistakable. I was being followed. Every time I turned a corner, every time I walked down a new aisle, the footsteps seemed to get closer. more deliberate. The church was empty, but I could feel the presence of someone behind me, walking in sync with my own movements. I stopped, and the footsteps stopped with me. I turned slowly, my eyes darting around the dark corners of the church. The candlelight flickered in the stillness, casting long, wavering shadows, but there was no one. No figure in the doorway, no movement in the pews, nothing. Yet, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, of being followed. I was on edge now, my breath shallow as I hurried toward the back door. I reached for the handle, but my hand froze just before it touched the cold metal. The footsteps had stopped again, but something was different. There was a presence behind me, closer now, so close I could feel the air shift, a breath on the back of my neck, a whisper in my ear. Asterisk, you're not alone. I spun around, my heart hammering in my chest, but there was nothing there. The church was silent, empty, just as it had been when I entered. But the voice, I could still feel it, ringing in my ears, echoing in my mind. I didn't wait any longer. I yanked the door open and stumbled out into the night, the cold air hitting me like a shock to my system. My heart was still racing, my legs shaky beneath me as I stepped away from the church, but I didn't look back. I couldn't. The rain had started again, falling softly, the quiet sound of it filling the space around me. I got into my car, my hands trembling as I gripped the steering wheel. The door of the church closed behind me with a soft creak, and I drove away, the headlights cutting through the fog. The rest of the drive was uneventful, the roads empty, the town slowly fading behind me. But no matter how far I got, no matter how much time passed, I couldn't shake the feeling. The feeling that someone had been following me, that something had been waiting for me inside that church. I don't know if I'll ever go back to that town, to that church. But I know one thing for sure, I wasn't alone in there. And whatever it was that followed me, I'm certain it's still out there, waiting for someone else to step inside. It had been a long week. I'd been running from one meeting to another, barely finding time to eat or sleep, let alone enjoy any of the beautiful landscape around me. So when I finally found myself on a winding road that led through an old, sleepy village, I decided to take a break. The town was small, too small to be noticed by most travelers, and I figured I'd find a quiet spot to relax and clear my mind. As I drove through, I saw an old church on the hill, its spire rising above the mist like a forgotten monument. The road leading to it was narrow, bordered by overgrown trees and thick fog that lingered in the cool air. Something about the church intrigued me. It was isolated, sitting at the edge of the village like it had been there forever. I parked my car near the entrance, under the shadow of the stone building, and stepped out into the damp air. The rain had been falling off and on, leaving the streets slick and the ground soft beneath my feet. I wasn't expecting anything special, just a quiet place to sit for a moment, think, maybe get some fresh air. But as I stood there, at the threshold, I felt an odd pull. The door was ajar, creaking in the wind, and I could see the faint glow of candlelight through the crack. I pushed it open and stepped inside. The air was thick, cool, and smelled of old wood and incense. The interior was dimly lit by the candles, their flames flickering against the stone walls. The floor was covered with old, worn pews, many of them crooked, some leaning at odd angles. their once beautiful upholstery now faded and torn. The altar stood at the front, simple but striking, bathed in the dim glow from a few candles placed around it. It was peaceful, or at least it should have been. I walked further inside, the sound of my footsteps muted by the carpet on the stone floor. The silence in the church was oppressive, like it had been waiting for someone, or something. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The atmosphere felt heavy, as if the place had absorbed the weight of its surroundings over the centuries. The walls, the floors, even the air seemed thick with something unspoken. That's when I saw her. She was sitting in one of the pews, near the front of the church, her head bowed in prayer, a figure in a long, dark coat that blended into the shadows. I hadn't noticed her when I first entered, but now that I saw her, I couldn't look away. There was something about her that felt out of place. Her presence was quiet, almost too quiet, like she was a part of the church itself, like she had always been there. She didn't seem to notice me, or if she did, she didn't acknowledge my presence. I stepped closer, unsure of what to do. The silence between us stretched thin, and I could feel the air growing heavier with each step I took toward her. When I was only a few feet away, she looked up. Her eyes were dark, her face pale, framed by dark hair that hung loosely around her shoulders. She stared at me for a moment, her gaze steady, piercing, and then she spoke, her voice soft but firm. "This church was built on a graveyard," she said, the words floating through the air like they were meant only for me. I stopped in my tracks. I wasn't sure why her words unnerved me, but they did. It was as though she had broken some unspoken rule, something that had always been hidden beneath the surface. I glanced around, the church suddenly feeling much older, much more alive with history than I had realized before. "The people who built it knew," she continued, her voice low and almost reverent. They knew what lay beneath, but they built it anyway. They thought the land would forget, but it never does. The dead never forget. I didn't know what to say. I had heard stories of towns and villages built on burial grounds, places where old rituals and customs had been lost to time, where the spirits of the past still roamed, restless and angry. But I didn't believe in that stuff. I thought it was all folklore, stories meant to scare children or drive tourists to the nearest haunted spot. But the way she spoke, the way her eyes seemed to look through me, made me question everything I thought I knew. I opened my mouth to say something, but before I could, she stood up, her movements slow and deliberate. She didn't look at me directly. Instead, she stared at the altar, her expression unreadable. "They're still here," she whispered, more to herself than to me, as if she were speaking to the very air around us. "The spirits are restless. You shouldn't have come." I took a step back, unsure of how to respond. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. The room seemed colder now, the shadows deeper, and I could almost feel the weight of the past pressing against my chest. I wanted to leave, but I couldn't bring myself to move. There was something about her, something unsettling in her presence that made it hard to break eye contact, hard to tear myself away. She turned to face me, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of something in her eyes, a kind of sadness, but also a quiet acceptance. She seemed to know something I didn't. She stepped toward me, and for a moment, I thought she might say something else, but instead, she simply reached out and touched my arm. The sensation was cold, like ice, like the chill of death itself. Her fingers, though soft, sent a jolt of energy through me, as though they had passed through layers of time, layers of the earth beneath us. Her touch didn't last long, but when it ended, I felt the weight of it in my bones. A sensation that lingered even after she withdrew her hand. "You don't understand," she said, her voice soft now, almost mournful. But you will. You'll feel it too, when you leave. The land remembers. The dead remember." I didn't know what to say. I didn't know what to do. I wanted to speak, to ask her questions, but I couldn't. My throat felt tight, my words trapped behind the weight of the silence. The church around us seemed to close in, the shadows darker now, and the faintest sounds, like whispers or distant footsteps, began to echo from the corners of the room. I had to leave. I turned quickly, heading for the door. My footsteps hurried, but as I reached the entrance, I stopped. I couldn't help it. I looked back. She was standing there still, her eyes fixed on me, but her face was different now. It wasn't just the sadness that I saw in her gaze, but something else, something deeper, darker. She wasn't just a woman anymore. She was part of the church, part of the land beneath it. She was one of them. And then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said, "You'll be back." I didn't look back again. I rushed outside, my heart pounding in my chest. The rain now falling harder, the world outside seeming clearer. But the weight of her words clung to me like a shadow. The moment I stepped into my car and drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't leaving the church behind. The land she spoke of, the spirits. The feeling that something ancient had awakened when I stepped inside, it followed me. It pressed in on me even as the town disappeared behind me, even as I drove miles away from that place. And now, every time I close my eyes, I can hear the whispers, the voices of the dead, calling from beneath the earth. I don't know if I'll ever go back to that church, but I know, deep down, that it's waiting for me, waiting for all of us. And the spirits, they never forget. I don't know what possessed me to go to that church. I'm not particularly religious, nor am I one to seek out old buildings for some sense of adventure or spiritual awakening. But something about it called to me. It started with the town quiet, isolated, a place where it seemed like time had slowed down. I had been on the road for hours, needing to rest, and I happened to see the church at the far end of the village. It was old, weathered by time and the elements, its stone walls cracked and fading, the tall spire of the tower rising against the gray sky like a forgotten sentinel. I don't know why I thought it would be a good idea to stop. Maybe it was. The fact that the rain had started to fall, soft and steady, making everything feel too still. Or maybe it was the strange pull I felt toward the building. Something in the air around it made me feel like I had no choice. I parked my car near the entrance, and before I even stepped out, the quiet of the place settled over me like a blanket. The town felt deserted, no movement in the streets, no lights in the windows. The air smelled of damp earth and stone, the kind of smell you only get when something has been left alone for years. I pushed open the heavy wooden door of the church, and the creak echoed through the stillness. The inside was cold, the air thick with dust and something else, something ancient. The dim light filtering through the stained glass windows barely illuminated the stone floors. The church felt untouched, as though it had been frozen in time. With the pews scattered haphazardly and the altar at the far end shrouded in shadows. The air was thick with the scent of old wood, mildew, and something faintly metallic, like the church had absorbed centuries of silence and sorrow. I walked slowly toward the altar, drawn by an odd, quiet force. There was nothing remarkable about it at first glance, just a simple stone structure draped with faded cloth, candles flickering weakly around it. But the longer I stood there, the more I felt something shifting. The shadows in the room seemed to move, ever so slightly, and the air grew colder, pressing in around me. I took a step closer to the altar, my footsteps muffled on the worn floor, and then it happened. The altar changed. It wasn't a dramatic change, but it was enough for me to notice. The cloth on the altar, which had been simple and worn, now appeared darker, almost black, and there was something resting on top of it. A small, unfamiliar object. A carved figurine, no bigger than my palm, with intricate patterns etched into the wood. I hadn't seen it before, I was sure of it. But now, it was there, sitting perfectly still on the altar, as though it had always been there. I blinked, feeling a shiver crawl up my spine, and for a moment I thought I might be imagining it. But when I looked again, the object was still there, unchanged. I reached out to touch it, my fingers trembling as I ran them over the carved patterns. It felt cold, colder than it should have been, as though it had been frozen by something unseen. I pulled my hand back, feeling uneasy, but when I looked at the altar again, I noticed something else. The candles that had been flickering weakly a moment before had now grown brighter, their flames dancing in a way that didn't seem natural. The shadows in the room stretched longer, the light from the candles casting strange shapes on the walls. I stepped back, my heart beginning to race. The atmosphere had changed. The room felt heavier now, as if it was closing in around me, pressing in with every breath. I didn't know why, but I felt as though I needed to leave. I turned toward the door, but as I did, I looked back at the altar, and it had changed again. The cloth was back to its faded state, but the figurine was gone. There was nothing on the altar now, nothing at all. I blinked, confused, my thoughts racing. Had I imagined it? Had I somehow misremembered? I stepped closer, my heart pounding, but the altar was bare. I reached out a hand, still unsure, but before I could touch it again, I heard it. A soft, faint whisper. At first, I thought it was the wind outside, or maybe a trick of my mind, but it came again. The whispering wasn't clear, not in words I could make out, but it was there, just beyond my reach. The sound filled the church, seeming to come from all around me, from the walls, the floor, the very air itself. I turned again, but the church was still empty. There was no one here. I was alone. The whisper grew louder, though more insistent, like it was beckoning me, calling me to the altar. I took another step forward, my mind racing. I didn't know what was happening, didn't understand why the room felt so strange, so full of pressure, but something in me urged me to stay, to reach for the altar again, to touch whatever it was that had changed. As I neared it once more, I felt something else. The altar had changed again. This time, the cloth was darker, richer in color, and the figurine was back, sitting perfectly on top. But this time, it was different. The figurine was no longer wood. It was metal, blackened, twisted metal, with sharp edges that looked like they had been carved with some kind of unknown symbol. I couldn't look away. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I could feel the air growing colder around me. The room closing in as the shadows seemed to grow longer. I reached out, my fingers trembling as they brushed the cold metal. The moment I touched it, I felt a shock run through me, as though the very fabric of the room had snapped. The sound of the whispering grew louder, now clear, and it was calling my name. My vision blurred, the room spinning around me as the shadows closed in, wrapping around me like a blanket. Asterisk, you are here. You are one of us. I didn't know where the voice came from, but it was everywhere, filling the room, filling my head, and my body felt frozen. I wanted to run. I wanted to leave. But something in the air was holding me there, pulling me closer to the altar, to whatever was on it. I looked again. The altar had changed once more, its appearance now shifting every time I glanced away. It was as though the church itself was alive, breathing, changing, forcing me to stay, forcing me to watch as it morphed before my very eyes. The whisper came again, louder this time. Asterisk, you cannot leave. You are part of the change. And I knew, deep down, that it was true. The church wasn't just a building. It wasn't just a place of worship. It was something far older, far darker. Something that fed on the souls of those who walked inside, trapping them within its walls, forever changing them with each passing moment. I don't know how long I stood there, caught between the shifting altar and the endless whispering voice that surrounded me, but eventually I ran. I turned and fled from the church, the sound of my footsteps pounding in the silence, the door slamming behind me as I stepped into the cold night air. The fog had thickened outside, but it felt like a breath of fresh air compared to the suffocating presence inside the church. I haven't been back since, but I can still feel it, the changes. The altar that shifts and changes every time I close my eyes, the whispers that seem to follow me wherever I go. Something in that church is still waiting, still changing, and I know that someday it will call me back, and when it does, I won't be able to turn away.